In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Bless us, O Lord, in these thy gifts, which are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Father Richard. And thank you all for joining us today. So the combination of the Impact Investing Conference and ICUSTA, which is the International Council of Universities of St. Thomas Aquinas, we thought would be a wonderful way to make new connections and really put a Thomistic spin on the Impacting Conference in a way that would be informal, but yet also fit the mission of this institution, certainly, and the institutions gathered here today. So impact investing is something that is significant for our world because it in some ways allows us to enliven the missions of our institutions in a more concrete way for the world to understand. So that's an important element that I appreciate, and I'm so glad that we're here to do this. So my pleasure and privilege is to invite Dean Bina George to come back to the podium, and we will be on with lunch and with the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ludwig. So, once again, welcome to the Impact Investing Summit. The future is in your hearts and hands. We are excited to start the discussion here at this forum that includes the delegates from the International Council of Universities of St. Thomas Aquinas. Particularly because as I was reading through the documents of the ICUSTA, I read this phrase, united in our dedication to bringing our efforts to the service of the human family. You know, what better phrase could we think of to actually indicate what we are trying to do? United in our dedication to bringing our efforts to the service of the human family, and if I may add, and all that coexists with us on this planet. And impact investing is a driver to positive change in making sure that all of these things flourish. And that flourishing is important to us in our mission, as Dr. Ludwig mentioned, and to all of us gathered here. So I will not belabor too much on what impact investing is. I believe most of you know, but just for the purposes of making sure we're all on the same page, essentially, impact investing is investments made with the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. The reason that we wanted to have this conference and this gathering is to make sure that we start that discussion, right? To drive positive change, to influence behavior, you need to start that conversation and to figure out what all you can do to make that change. So collaboration is crucial. Bringing stakeholders from different areas is crucial to making sure that we can effect that change and increase awareness about impact leadership, investment, and performance with a purpose, a positive purpose. So, I mentioned the importance of the united part, and today would not have been possible if not for the collaboration of some very important people. So I would like to thank Lauren Fossler and Southern Impacting Investing Alliance, Mike Mentes, and the Texas Impacting Investing Alliance, and Paula Ferrari and Nana Gagliato for working with us on this very important summit. We are glad to have this conversation start here at this forum. We will continue that with 3 different panel sessions. The first one on social entrepreneurship, the second one on how we define and measure impact, and the third one on how to accelerate impact with investments. And our goal is to end with a closing keynote that drives future action. The purpose of the summit is to inform, but my hope is that we will all leave here with ideas on how we can effect that change. And With that, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for this session, Ms. Tess Mateo. I know you have the bio with you, most of you, but I would like to read it out because she is someone who has done much in this field. But first, I must mention this. Her father was an alumnus of the, not going to say this right, but the University of St. Thomas in Philippines. So, yes. Tess Mateo is Senior Advisor to AQAL Capital, Special Advisor on Gender and Environment to the United Nations, and Managing Director and Founder of CXCatalysts, which develops public-private partnerships in clean energy, water, sustainable food, infrastructure, and health. CXCatalysts promotes Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and co-produces the Global Green Inclusive and Innovation Summit with UN Global Compact and International Day for Women and Girls in Science with UNCTAD. Prior to CXCatalysts, Tess worked for Global CEO PricewaterhouseCoopers, where it was a $31 billion firm with 155,000 employees in 140 plus countries. Please join me in welcoming Tess Mateo to speak.
Thank you all for inviting me to be part of this exciting initiative here at the University of St. Thomas. My dad was a graduate of University of Santo Tomas in Manila, and I feel as though this is a sign for me to come back here. And the fact to introduce all of these ideas to this collection of USD campuses is really something that is an honor for me. And I tell you this because for the past 20 years, I'm actually advising governments and CEOs of the largest multinationals of the world on what they need to do for a sustainable future. And one of the things that was told to me by the dean of the Harvard Design School was saying the challenge with sustainability is we haven't captured the hearts and minds of people. What we've done is we've given them the business cases, we've given them the regulations, but we haven't really done anything beyond that. And so I hope that with some of the ideas that I shared today, that it might inspire some of you to see how you can take it forward to your own constituents and your own campuses. I'd like to get a sense of who's in the room. Of those who are affiliated with an academic institution, not just students, but just in the administration and management of an academic institution, can you raise your hands, please? Because that's about a third of the room. How about students? How many students do we have here? Okay, we have a little bit. How about business people? Okay, great. So one of the things, the reason why I get invited to speak to a lot of my background is in restructuring companies, is I help people find, or companies and governments, to create jobs and find and drive business innovation. So a lot of the work that I've been doing the first 20 years of my career was about how do I create more shareholder value. So that was really, really focused on a set of parameters that drove the global capital markets. What happened was in 2008, I co-chaired the Vision 2050 work of part of the World Business Council of Sustainable Development. And in that course of work, I became a green capitalist. I became more than just a person focused on financials, but because of my credibility in the global capital markets, part of the restructuring of the US capital markets, and then with the global capital markets in 2008, then I became now this champion of green. So what I love the most about the title of this conference is the future is in your hearts and minds. And this is the first time, and I shared this with Paula Ferrari, this is the first time I've ever seen in the same title, not a subtitle, not a topic, or not an idea, but actually in the title of a conference with financing, hearts, and hands. Usually you see these in different sections, but you've never seen it combined in this way. And I think this is what the world needs, which is why I'm very excited to be here with all of these, everyone who can influence the next generation of leaders, because we need a human-centered, compassionate-centered, redevelopment of what we think is success in the future. So as mentioned, I talked about this Vision 2050 work, and it's something that I think would be valuable to anybody could read. It's a report that was issued by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and it was issued in 2010. And it will surprise you, but many of the things, including the political environment around the world, actually was envisioned over 10 years ago, right? And so we had a scenario. Is there anybody here from Shell by any chance? Are people familiar with the Shell scenarios? So Shell, as a company, has basically introduced this concept of scenario planning. And what scenario planning does is it takes what are the extremes, looking at certain parameters, what are the extremes of what could happen in the world. And the reason why you do scenario planning is because in the energy industry, all those investments have a 30 to 50-year window of investment to realization. So they have to look at and prepare for, in any of these 4 scenarios, what could happen so that what the decision I make today is going to last and withstand any of these potential scenarios. So when this report was written, we were at the very, very heights of globalization. Everybody was embracing it. We are going to create new jobs, new opportunities around the world. We're going to have trickle-down prosperity because of all this global trade. In 2008, we never would have imagined that the borders would be closing, but the scenarios that Shell said is we could be in a completely opposite scenario, anti-globalization, borders closed, wars happening for that. And because that scenario was planned and envisioned in 2008, this report still stands today and everything it says around it. And it took 2.5 years for this one sentence to get 23 countries, 400 multinational companies in 16 industry sectors agree to a vision of what 2050 would be. And that is 9 billion people living well within the limits of the planet by 2050. The negotiation of who defines how many people will be in 2050, the negotiation of, well, what do we want to say is going to happen, and then where are we going to put the limits? So this negotiated phrase came from a 2-year effort around the world. And when I say 23 countries, it was all the BRICS at the time, so that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, hosted the United States, the EU, it was in Bogota, Colombia, are some of the engagements. But this is the context of what all the work and impact investing should go towards, because this project was initiated because of the global financial crisis. The question was, well, if everybody was assuming a different industry, a different country was going to take care of something, but then look at what happened with the global financial crisis, it meant that what if we all want a sustainable world, we have the wrong assumption. So then all of a sudden, it was the first time in all of the industrial world where all these multinational companies actually came together. So 2015, who's familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, so the Sustainable Development Goals is the first time in the history of mankind that the world's leaders all over the world, 196 countries, member countries of the United Nations, all the multinational companies, all the civil society agreed on the world's biggest problems. So when you hear the word problems and challenges, who are the business school students here? Any students? All right, when you hear problems and challenges, what do you think? Business opportunity, right? So when you have an agreement of what are the biggest issues that we have to address collectively around the world, that is an opportunity of where industry is using, of where the investments are. This has become a platform for all the governments around the world to coalesce and to work with their stakeholders in the private sector or in civil society of what they want to address together. These Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm not going to go through each one because you can Google this, has 169 indicators and then 265 specific measures. So it could be anything of, how many third grade, how many 5-year-olds have kindergarten opportunities. But the reason why this has become an effective planning tool is because if we know where the challenges are, we know what the governments have to deliver or have committed to deliver, then all of these sectors can then have a common language on how to operate their businesses or their countries or the municipalities down at the local level. This is what you look at when you wanted to look at the SDGs in context. So at the very lowest level, here's what we're talking about the planet. We're talking about the SDGs specific to water, land, ecosystems, the basics of what makes the planet. The second set of donuts is really about the society. Like, how can we make sure that there's no hunger? What are we going to do to make sure that people have access to sanitation and water? What are we going to do about education? The economy layer, of which there are only 4 SDGs, is really just looking at how do we function so that when you talk about economy, you're talking about the trading of products, services, and capital. And lastly, the 17th SDG, which goes straight through, is the partnership level. Have anyone heard of the 4th Industrial Revolution? Okay. So the 4th Industrial Revolution was introduced in 2016. It was when the Germans decided to take a 50-year horizon of their strategic planning as a country. And so Enrique von Schiele, who is listed as the source of this document, was asked to say, what does the future look like? It was the first time that he and the people that were part of this project saw the convergence of 3 different systems. And that's a convergence of the physical, the technology, as well as the virtual convergence of these 3 different sets of data sets. And so what's happening is that up until 2016, which is right past the 2013, where you see the slope going exponentially, the world has always operated on a linear planning model. And what I mean by linear, A plus B equals C. You could map that out. We are now in about the 2nd year of exponential growth. It is the first time that we have the available technologies where we can crunch enough data sets. And so what's happening around the world, and this is why all of a sudden, are people familiar with Thomas Piketty and his work with inequality? Anyone read his stuff? Well, anyways, the first time that inequality has mapped against countries or even inside of certain countries was because the data set to crunch all these data sets is now available. So where we are right now is, where 2013 was the beginning of the 4th Industrial Revolution, and this is where you have so much data that we are able to predict predict based on the data sets that we have that was not available in the past. So if you look at the exponential growth, this is where life is getting a little bit confusing. This is why the world leaders are very much focused on job creation, because without having this, without young people, of which there is a big youth bulge going on until 2025, without people employed doing something purposeful that they like to do, we end up with a lot of conflicts. So this convergence of the physical, digital, and technology worlds these are the 4 IR technologies. This is what they refer to. If you've heard of, have anyone here heard of blockchain or artificial intelligence or any of these, the Internet of Things? All of these technologies are basically going to be underpinning 90% of the economies of the world. So we may not see it because these technologies are actually here to make things easier and to facilitate what we operate on a daily basis. So it's kind of, we won't notice except everything gets easier. But what happens is that when things get easier, is that it also creates opportunities of abuse, which is what we've seen happen around the world. Like where it was used to create benefits is to give a voice to the underserved or for those who are marginalized, but people have used it against us. So this ability to process and analyze a tremendous amount of data is actually changing the way we all operate. And as educators, as people who are responsible for developing the minds of the future leaders, and that's what I was so blessed to read about, was that ethics, business ethics, this has got to be the core of what we teach the future leaders, because there's a lot of responsibility that goes along with having all this data. There's a lot of, I would say in the first 2 years of when this concept of fourth industrial revolution, people were so enamored by the enabling technologies that they actually forgot to focus on the human side of what these technologies could do. And that's where the value of the education opportunities that you provide everyone is. If you provide the context in which this happens, but then the future business leaders, the future government leaders understand, but wait a second, we have to make sure that this is done in line to preserve as well as protect and support humanity. This is why this 4IR has been redeveloped with a human-centered propensity. And this is what, we were just talking about this in the World Economic Forum in Davos this past January, because this reboot of the 4IR with a human-based center is what's going to actually change what these data sets are used for. So this is a very messy chart, but what I wanted to show is that in the next, so the SDGs was a plan of where the governments, civil society, and businesses said they wanted to do by 2030. That's a 2030 goal. These are the new industry sectors. These are the growth opportunities associated with those SDGs. And let's say, I'll take one for instance. There's 4 main hubs, which is food and agriculture, cities, energy and materials, and health and well-being. If you take one of those, let's look at food and agriculture. It's about how do we reduce food waste in the value chain. That specific is the first one on the left, but what the businesses are saying is the calculation is $25 trillion will be spent in these 60 markets. And these 60 markets is if you're preparing your students for jobs, if you're preparing your students to lead, they should be into these sectors. And the reason why is these are the sectors that are going to be the most important sectors in the next 2 decades. So the reason, when I presented this to business, then they're looking at, okay, well, how can I develop products and services to go into this sector? How do I leverage existing, investments, my manufacturing capacity to approach any of these industry sectors? As educators, how do I prepare my students and the future leaders to understand about these opportunities? And what's amazing, I think I mentioned this to someone before, is I spoke at the Wharton Business School it was then called Social Enterprise Conference, probably about 15 years ago, or 10 years ago. And 5 of the students there who came up afterwards, and I gave them, this only came out in 2017, but in 2008 and 9 was the Vision 2050, which had a similar, it was not as detailed as this, of what are the fast-growing industry sectors. I am so proud, and whenever I get these emails from these former students who show up at any of my talks, is they said, I made my first million in the 2 sectors you said would have the fastest growth. And I did it, and one was a blockchain and renewable energy, and so she feels good that she did that, because right now, this is basically a map, the map of who controls the energy sector, who controls and manages the food chains. These are all things that if you have the map, you can kind of plan of where the resources will go and where will all the opportunities be created. And what I wanted to note here is that more than 50% of these sectors and opportunities will be in the developing countries. We may not have to move to the developing countries to support these opportunities. We could simply invest in those countries. But as a global collection of educators, dealing with the future innovators, the future leaders, the future, educators as well, is this is where you have a tremendous opportunity to actually highlight. So we have, you know, when you look at how different institutions use these maps of where the vision could be or where the opportunities are, in the report Better Business World, BCSD 2017, you will find the specific, you know, $3 trillion will go in this sector, $2 trillion or $2 billion will come from this part of the world. These things have been down to the, this is a meta-analysis of where the governments have negotiated, where they're going to create these sectors. So, but one of the things that's interesting is this past November, the Club of Rome, which is former heads of state as well as private sector leaders, they put out a meta-analysis of all the reports that were written about sustainable development as well as climate change. And what they said was if we achieve all 17 of the SDGs, it would take 3 planets. Well, if we don't have 3 planets, what do we need to do? So there are certain SDGs that are going to take priority over the other SDGs. And so right now, we have 12 years. Have you heard of the 12 years for the climate change to reverse where we are today? Because if you believe in those 12 years, that we have a very short period of time to kind of look at the way this is, whether you believe it or not, whether you believe in climate change is actually irrespective, because the $25 trillion is going to be spent with or without whatever words you want to use, because the business opportunity and the government opportunity is there, right? So if you wanted to prioritize which one is more valuable than the other, if you wanted to reduce carbon emissions, it would have to be, these are the 5 that you would prioritize. It would be renewable energy, sustainable food chains, gender equality, and education for all. So if the traditional ways of creating wealth, according to the Credit Suisse versus Boston's database, wealth management database of people holding assets of more than 5 million, was in manufacturing, healthcare, technology, finance, and real estate. Those are the traditional 5 ways of wealth creation. When you look at the spend of this 25 trillion, the 5 is going to be around its DRAPE, digital, renewables, agriculture, transport, and education. So these 5 have not been traditional wealth creating opportunity sectors, but they are in this world where we're trying to create and achieve these SDGs. So the funding for the SDGs is going to be coming from, this is just it's a big chart, and I'm not even going to go into the details. I'm just using this as a segue into the impact investing. I've talked about where all the business opportunities are going to be, and talking about where the governments and private sector is planning to put the money. This is just really about who's going to fund this transformation. Where is the $25 trillion coming from? And these are the different instruments. The instrument we're talking about today is called impact investing. So impact investing, what is it? Well, Dr. George had mentioned what it was in the front, but if you look at this spectrum of when you're talking about where does capital come from, it's I'm giving you money, which is the philanthropic point of view, to all the way to mainstream investment. But there are different expectations and targets for the desired returns. So when you're talking about philanthropy, you're looking for impact, you're not necessarily looking for financial return. Whereas all the way on the other side of the spectrum is your traditional investments. Now, for how many of you here are investors? Okay, so at least a third of you are investors, and if you use different lenses, sometimes what happens is your investments is through your jobs, through the pensions, or through the investments, even as an institution like University of St. Thomas, somebody is taking the money that has been endowed to the university and putting it somewhere. And so you see a lot of activism on campuses today because you have institutions who've invested in sectors that don't. So when you look at the 3 kind of pockets or themes of impact investment, you have the thematic, which is basically, oh, I'm going to invest in companies that support women. I'm going to invest in companies that address education or help children. Then you have what are called the sustainable, so that's ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. And that has been probably since the 70s, right? So that lens is called a positive screen of impact investing. And then you have the socially responsible, which is basically a negative screen. And so, there's different ways to skin a cat. And so here's a different, let me show you this one. Oh, sorry. So you have the traditional investing where you're seeking financial returns on the vertical axis on the top left, and then on the bottom right is the traditional philanthropy. Then you have financial first within the impact investing, which is the top right corner where you're both seeking a financial return as well as an impact. And then you also have impact first. So, and then there's the integral investors that look into all of it big. And sometimes that's requires a lot more analytical support, which is why there are fewer who are in that impact integral investing space, even though that's desired. Now, when I talked about the 4 IR technologies, this is the first time that we can actually measure impact. The challenge with impact investing in the past was how do you know you did what you said you're going to do? How do you know you're influencing or impacting this many people? That wasn't available until recently with the 4 IR technologies. So we are at the very, very beginning of impact investing. If you consider the internet came in, 1995, 1996, the mainstream came in at 2000 to 2002. We are at the very beginning of impact investing. Because of this ability to measure impact in real time using smartphones, that's going to change the trajectory. So these are the asset classes. I'm not going to do a business school financial presentation today, but just to give you a sense at a very high level of what are we talking about of the impact investing instruments. So the grant support all the way to the left in the lower diagram, which is the grant support. That's where there's not a requirement for financial, it's more looking for impact. All the way to the right where you have private equity players, and that's looking specifically for financial return. And then the upper diagram is looking at the business cycle and who is funding it, and there's some sample funds that are there. So I had spent most of my talk focused on where the money is being spent. The impact investing, again, is how it relates to where these business opportunities are. This is the ecosystem of impact investing. And what you will see and what schools, I presented, where was I was at Columbia Business School, from where I graduated, and I presented this slide, actually a presentation not too different than this, because what the students there wanted to know is like, okay, we hear about impact investing, we know it's a high growth sector, like, tell us, how does it all relate? Because you hear different aspects of it. So I know this is quite small to read. This is sourced from the World Economic Forum. But at the center, the work that I do primarily has been in investment targets. The companies wish to invest in the projects that I'm working on, or the sources of capital, which is on the top left corner, which is the capital providers. This ecosystem, and what the arrows will show you is what is the transaction between these different stakeholders. Because when you understand how things move in an ecosystem, it makes it easier to understand, well, where is my core capacity? Where's my, where should I partner to find and collaborate with partners that will fulfill or complement my skill sets? This ecosystem continues to evolve with new technologies, but this was based on 2013, but it's still quite relevant today. So when we talk about, and this was, I initially thought this was mostly around students, but this is something that you can facilitate when you're dealing with the future generations, is that most of all these opportunities is about mindset, more than anything. And that's what's so wonderful about the theme of this presentation of the heart and hands, the future's in your hearts and hands. is the mindset to be open, because what we see today, the opportunities for students who enter the system today, those opportunities are going to be completely different in 4 years. You have sectors that are really, really going to be changing with automation, and because of this exponential growth model that we have, and the impact that these technologies, whether you see them or not, will have on the future generations, it is how do we enable our future leaders to understand and be open to these new ideas. So one of the things that oftentimes students go to school and they say, oh, I want to be an analyst at this company when I graduate. We cannot have people thinking like that, because the opportunities with someone fixated on a job title over a sector, sectors and companies are being, for the first time, they start in 18 months, they obliterate. Are people familiar? Do you remember a few years ago called Pokemon Go? There was this big thing that happened around the world, and it went from a zero, it was just an idea, and it went from a zero worth zero, and then it became a $2 billion company in 18 months, and then 2.5 years later, it was done. The future jobs are not going to be these large multinational companies. Every single multinational company today is now carving itself up into smaller units because of the rate of change is happening too fast to manage big assets. So the mindset of the young people today and in the future is really has to be focused on how do I stay nimble, how do I stay creative, how do I learn to care, and how do I use my resources to make the world a better place. So if I'm going to go back to these SDGs, and this is something you can, as academic institutions, and I know the Cameron Business School is a signatory to the UN Global Compact, these are the principles for the next 20 years to 2030. This is where a lot of resources and the way people describe the opportunities are in these pockets. And these are all very much aligned to what I know my father, as a graduate of UST, always talked about. My dad came from the provinces, and then he was a scholarship kid to UST, and then he was #1 of his class at the medical school, and he ended up at Massachusetts General. So that, to him, was just an incredible opportunity, but all of these things is something that he learned, as growing up and being educated at UST. And I think that if we are able to use this tool, again, this is just a framework, this is just a map, but if you use this map, so you have the SDGs here, and then you use these technologies. So if your schools are not advanced in technologies, then partner with schools who have strong engineering programs, right? These technologies, there are, if you look at the data behind it of how many billions of dollars are going to develop each of these, then these are just opportunities that your students are going to be available. So the worst thing that happens to people is if you go and take a job in a shrinking sector. That's where you get a lot of resentment, you get a lot of disenfranchised, you lose purpose. But if you're using these technologies to achieve the SDGs in these sectors, this is a map of opportunities. If you see where the companies, the governments, the colleges, the universities, the nonprofits who are focusing, because this $25 trillion, you can just go into the report and find out, oh, this company in this country is going to be doing ABC. Well, I want to make sure that my students, my graduates, my networks are going to be into that sector. And if you prioritize specifically on renewable energy, sustainable food chains, I read that the Cameron School of Business has a women in energy sector. We are in the energy hub of North America. This is a wonderful opportunity for those women to succeed and to thrive in an industry that's going to explode. So I think in summary, because I know I'm supposed to be, I wanted to make sure I was available for questions. But in summary, Again, the industry sectors use the SDGs as a framework. Again, if you are able to use the 4IR technologies as a map, as well as a way to organize some of the ideas that you have of where you want to create opportunities and leaders, that's one. But if anyone has any questions, I know I kind of went fast because I wanted to cover a lot of slides in a short period of time, but if anyone has questions, please, let me know. I can answer any of them now. Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
I have one question. You mentioned that it would take 3 planets.
Yes.
So could you elaborate on that?
Okay, so this was interesting about the Clover. So oftentimes, just like companies, governments, or academic institutions, we sit in silos, and we don't really understand that, okay, if I spend this much money on a program to end poverty, they have measures. Certain governments will say, well, I'm going to spend this much on subsidizing food for young children, or I am going to, on the front end, do something with homelessness. So when they say 3 planets, it's the way that the meta-analysis went was that they looked at what the countries committed to spend and what they needed to do against the planetary limits. The planetary limits is if you have this much forest, if you have this much water, if you have this much, those 4 biospheres. If you look at these 4, that it wouldn't support the economic activity to achieve their planned targets, if that makes any sense. And so it's interesting that, we sit here, sometimes we sit, sitting in the United States, we're in a bubble because we're not feeling much of climate change. You don't feel climate change unless you're on one of the border territories, let's say in Louisiana, where you're losing coastlines, but we're not feeling it. We're not feeling it like they're feeling it in the Philippines. So one of the interesting things about the Philippines is that I had mentioned to my relatives, I'm like, listen, I'm going to buy you some properties in Michigan, which is one of the places where there's a lot of water, there's a lot of land, relatively inexpensive. I go, you should consider moving, because in 5 years, the number of typhoons that they have has exponentially increased, and the impacts and the ability for the government to recover from each one decreases. So if you don't have enough of the core natural resources, because our economies and our societies are based on the resources. So if we were sitting in Africa today, you will see that the migration north, away from the deserts, away from the food sources, is diminishing quite fast. But sitting in the United States, we're not going to feel this pain. The Europeans feel the pain, but in America we don't. Because if you're sitting, from outer space, you see North America still pretty green, but you don't see it in other parts of the world. So, good.
So I understand that you mentioned earlier that impact investment currently you observe the higher return. But in terms of the risk, what do you think is the trend of impact investing, especially with this current political environment? The political risk seems to be explosive. What's your...
I think impact investing is defined differently for different folks, and the risk your aversion to risk. But some people will say if you're impact first, then your risk profile is a lot different than one who's looking for financial returns. So and that's why the measures, and there will be a panel who was the second panel today, will be speaking more on risk, on impact measurements. But that's an excellent question, and I wouldn't say when you think of the geopolitical is always one of the risk factors, but you can stay away from that in some of the investments you make. So, people I'm originally from the state of Michigan, and I bought, 10 years ago, I was in a presentation where people were talking about the importance of water. Right, so I put on Zillow, Google search that there's any land so there's only 16 states without a water table problem in the United States. And I was at the time going to buy a property and invest in real estate because, again, the 5 sectors where you traditionally made money was real estate, manufacturing, finance, technology, and manufacturing. And I said, okay, well, this is interesting. I'm sitting in, I think it was in Brussels, and they're talking about, wow, water is going to be worth something in the future. And this is 2008, so I'm thinking, okay, I've got cash. There's a global financial crisis. Let me invest in something. And what I found out was I ended up buying a 75-acre farm in Michigan with great water sources between Ann Arbor and Chicago. And I can tell you that has more than 1,000 times what I spent, but I'm still holding it. But that's how you invest. So that didn't have a geopolitical, because when you're talking about the SDGs, these are basic human needs that are not being met today, right? So you kind of have to, but there's risk profiles for all of it. But I am not, geopolitical is an issue, but if you look at certain investment classes. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you so much, Tess, for sharing. For young people interested in learning more about impact investing, learning about exploring it on their own, what would you suggest to young people?
So the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, is actually an amazing resource that actually has a lot. What's interesting to me is that the traditional finance schools on the East Coast that have been deep into finance, right when the innovation happens, they've been talking about this for a long time, and now I'm seeing, a lot more schools. I think that it's like everything. There's early adopters, and then there's mainstream. And it's interesting all the different clubs that are happening, because then they're practicing in the environment of a safety net. But I would say the GIN network they also even have curriculums. They also have lots of resources online that connect you with everything, and as well as speakers. But these conferences, they give you, I think this is wonderful that we're doing this over holiday weekend, but if you did this early on in an academic school year, because I've spoken at a lot where it's early, and then they ask me to come back at the end and they tell me how they did, then they have contests. It's amazing the results of people. And these are the innovators. They start innovating and creating opportunities as they're going through school, and then their academic path is so much more purposeful because they're trying to learn, oh, I read about child slavery in this country, or maybe it's child trafficking. And then they get involved, and then they develop an app, but that app actually has other applications besides just helping that, and they actually make money. I mean, it's incredible that young people know how they think.
Tess, thank you so much. Thank you for reminding us that we need to educate our students to think creatively, that we need to continue to work creatively to make a positive change. And, remember, the future is in your hearts and hands. And so, a small gift to
Thank you.
And Dr. Stockton, I hear you. What's?
Thank you very much, Dean George, Director Teo. It's a wonderful presentation, and it was a real treat for the Inclusive Conference to join this lunch presentation. There are many of our partner schools that are actively engaged in social enterprise and a lot of projects related to what you spoke about today. I also don't want you to leave the room. Our Santo Tomas de Manila, we have our friends here at this back table. So make sure you can tell Dad you met the leaders of the university in Houston, Texas. For those Inclusive friends here at the lunch at 1:45, we will have our beginnings of the endings of the conference. We'll be back in Anderson Hall, 1:45. So, Dr. George, thank you so much for having us join you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stockton. The next session for the Impact Investing 2019 conference will